It's 6 o'clock. Can we start, ma'am?
Yes, please start.
Yes, sir. Thank you. So good evening, one and all. I welcome you all to today's Navigate Medico CME program. So without much delay, I think let us proceed with the program. As we all know, Dr. Mani Prasad ma'am is a senior faculty in the Clinical Research and Epidemiology at Institute of Liver and Biliary Sciences, New Delhi. Her chief areas of interest includes clinical epidemiology, guideline development, medical research, systematic reviews and meta-analysis, and evidence-based medicine. She has more than 2,900 citations with a H index of 20 and I-10 index of 26. She has 43 international articles in Medline Index journals. She has facilitated many workshops on research methodology, evidence-based medicine, and grade tool. And she had got gold medal in her MD final exam. And she is also the recipient of International Epidemiology Association Fellowship. Ma'am, it is a pleasure to have you here, and it is a actually great honor to have you here. So over to you, ma'am, for today's session on observational studies.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Preeti. And thank you also for the fabulous job you've been doing in moderating these sessions. I'm also very grateful to the participants who are making the effort to interact with us. And once again, this session will work best if there's maximum interaction. So towards the end, of course, we have the exercises, but even in the midst of the session, I encourage you to please unmute your microphone and speak up if you have a question or a suggestion or a comment or an objection, whatever it is. And I also encourage you to type in your questions and your comments and your suggestions into the chat box. So without much ado, I'm going to start sharing my screen. And this is what the story is looking like so far. Dr. Preeti, can you confirm that you can see my slide?
Yeah, ma'am.
Okay, great, thank you. So far in the first session, we've had 2 sessions in this module, and in the first session, we had spoken about an overview of study designs. So we had talked about all of the study designs that are there in clinical research, and we had discussed the advantages and disadvantages of each design. And then in the second session, we had taken up in detail the methodology and reporting of a particular kind of study, which is a randomized controlled trial. If you remember, I had told you that when we classify, we make the two big classifications of study design, the major classification, experimental and observational. And so randomized controlled trials are the prototype experimental study designs. And of course, in terms of yielding validity of studies of evidence, this is way superior to observational studies. And we had discussed all of the methodological issues in the reporting guidelines for randomized controlled trials. Now, what was pending and not discussed previously, the day before yesterday, we ran out of time and I could not take up subgroup analysis, which is a topic inherent to interpretation of results of randomized controlled trials. So maybe we can take up this in the last session and move ahead with the agenda. And the agenda for today is twofold. The first is to talk about measures of association, and the second is observational studies. So two big topics here that are on the agenda. Let's see how far we can make our way through these very, kind of major topics, and actually they deserve a lot of attention in terms of, value in clinical research and epidemiology. So I'm going to first start with measures of association, and I'm going to talk about this in the context of randomized controlled trials, because I'm going to carry on the discussion that we were having related to RCTs. And then when I talk about observational studies, I will extend this concept, the concept of measures of association, to observational studies as well. Right, so today, right now, for the first part of the session, we're talking about measures of association in the context of an RCT. And this is what the outline is looking like. I'm going to talk about relative risk, odds ratios, some other measures, juxtapose relative and absolute effects, and talk about interpretational challenges in the odds ratio. But first, let me ask you a question. And for this question, you can just type in your answers into the chat box. So I'm going to take a look into the chat box right after I finish asking you this, and I'm going to give you 1 minute to think about this, and then you can just type in your question. So we have a patient who's 64-year-old. He's male and he has hepatocellular carcinoma. And which of these treatments do you think is the best? There's 3 treatments. Treatment A reduces annual mortality by 25%. Treatment B requires 50 patients to be treated for 1 year to prevent 1 death. And treatment C reduces annual risk of death from 8% to 6%. So I want you to think about these 3 treatments, and please type into the chat box which treatment you think is the best, A, B, or C. So let's just wait for about maybe 1 minute, and until people can really think about it and, just assess and then type in your answer. And thank you, the answers are coming in already. Anybody else wants to answer? Okay, so pretty much all the answers that are coming in are A, treatment A, and this is what usually happens. Most of the audience does actually answer treatment A. But let me tell you, all of these treatments are actually expressing the same thing. So all of these are actually different ways of expressing the same result. And this is actually usually the case with studies, that the result is one thing, the data is one thing, and then there are so many different ways of expressing that same result by just, for the lack of a better word, manipulation of that data. And certainly, most people would find this expression the most appealing, annual mortality by 25%. And when I tell you, that this actually means the same thing, 50 patients need to be treated, and from 8 to 6%, it's referring to exactly the same thing. So let's see how this happens and how are results expressed. You may have come across such a newspaper headline previously. Economic reforms led to a decline in unemployment from 20% to 15%, thus reducing it by 25%. And so you might think to yourself, 20% to 15%, that's just a reduction of 5%, right? So why are they saying 25%? Well, does anybody want to venture an answer here by unmuting? How did they arrive at this result? They say 20% to 15%, and they say the reduction is by 25%. Well, I can't see the chat box. Okay, great. Somebody's written, thank you, Dr. Preeti. 5 is 1/4 of 20 and 25%. Yeah, exactly. So another way of saying this is actually like this. If 20% were to be 100, so if you take 20 as a whole, as 15 is 75, and therefore 5 is 25%, right? So basically, this 5% difference, it is 25% of the baseline. So the baseline is 20%. And so this difference of 5% is a proportion of the baseline, which is 25% of the baseline. And that's why we are saying that the reduction is by 25%. So actually, this simple difference, this difference in the baseline versus what you get after the intervention, this is the absolute risk reduction. So this is actually the same as risk difference. Risk difference is same as absolute risk reduction. This 20% is what you started out with, right? So that's the baseline risk. And what you landed up with after the intervention is 15%, that's the relative risk. And this 25%, which is the relative risk reduction, is basically the difference upon the baseline risk. That's relative risk reduction. So now think of it in terms of a trial. You say intervention led to decline in incidence of mortality. So incidence and risk are similar concepts, incidence, risk, and probability, or they're all referring to the same concept. So intervention led to decline in incidence of mortality from 20% in control group to 15% in intervention group, thus reducing it by 25%. So this baseline risk, that's what the control group risk is referring to. And after the intervention, you have an incidence of mortality of 15%, right? So basically, risk difference is a simple difference, 20 minus 15, that's 5. And then once again, if you apply the same logic, if 20 is taken as 100, then 15 is 75, right? And 5 is 25%. So the relative risk reduction is 25%. So now, if you think about it in another way, you're saying that there's a risk difference of 5%, right? Which means that there's 5 less deaths per 100 treated, correct? So in order to, so 5% is 5 per 100, so 5 less deaths per 100 treated with the new treatment. So if I ask you, how many will need to be treated in order to prevent 1 death? Can you tell me? Can you type it into the chat box, or can you unmute and tell me? So this risk difference of 5% means that there's 5 less deaths per 100. So if I were to ask you how many need to be treated to prevent 1 death, what is the answer? 100 need to be treated to prevent 5 deaths. how many need to be treated to prevent one death? 100 treated, 5 less deaths. So how many treated to prevent? Yeah, exactly. So that's 100 upon 5. This is basically unitary method, right? So that's 100 upon 5, that's 20. And so similarly, if the risk difference is 10%, it's 100 upon 10, that's 10. Number needed to be treated. Then if it's 20%, the risk difference, then 100 upon 20, right? That's 5. And if it's 50, so the risk difference is 50, it's 100 upon 50. That's number needed to treat is 2. So when the risk difference is expressed in percentages, then the number needed to treat is 100 upon the risk difference. And if the risk difference is expressed as decimal, so 0.1, 0.2, 0.5, and so on, then the number needed to treat is 1 upon the risk difference. So most people find it easier to work with percentages, and so that's why whenever you see a risk difference expressed as percentage, and the number needed to treat is 100 upon the risk difference. Okay. So number needed to treat is 100 upon risk difference in percentage, and in decimals it is 1 upon risk difference. So any questions so far? Any questions so far with regard to expression of the result in terms of absolute risk reduction, risk difference, baseline risk, relative risk reduction, and number needed to treat? Is there any questions? Please feel free to ask me. Okay, let's move ahead. So what is CONSORT say? We were talking about CONSORT all along, which are reporting guidelines for RCTs. And they actually say something about relative and absolute effects. And what is it? They say for binary outcomes, we must present both absolute and relative effect sizes. What does binary outcome mean? Basically, an outcome where it either happens or it does not happen, like mortality. You either die or you do not die. Similarly, tumor recurrence, it either recurs or it does not recur. Or you could say variceal bleed, bleeding happens or it doesn't happen. And so on and so forth. As opposed to continuous outcomes like length of stay. So if you are talking about length of stay of a patient in a hospital, that's not a binary outcome. It's in days, it's a continuous outcome. Or any quality of life scale. So that's also, or any lab parameter. So average CRP, for instance, that's also on a continuous. So for binary outcomes, and all of these measures, relative risk odds ratios, they're all for binary outcomes. So they either happen or they don't happen. And CONSORT recommends that we must present both absolute and relative effects. And here they give an example of how it is to be presented in a trial. So if you happen to be a postgraduate who's doing a randomized control trial for this thesis, or if you want to read up trials for your review of literature of whatever design you're employing in your thesis design, then this is how the results of RCTs are expressed. The risk of oxygen dependence or death was reduced by 16%, and they have a confidence interval. The absolute difference was minus 6.3, and then they have a confidence interval. Early administration of an estimated 16 babies would therefore prevent one baby dying or being long-term dependent on oxygen. So here you see, and then they have the table that is basically depicting exactly the same thing. So they did a trial where the outcome, they did a trial in children. I guess they had some intervention, and the outcome was death or oxygen dependence at expected date of delivery. I think maybe this was for steroids. And this is the actual result of the trial. They had 2 arms, early administration delayed. So in the intervention arm, 32% babies had the outcome. And the control arm, 38% had the outcome. So the risk difference is basically this minus this. So intervention minus control. So that's 31.9 minus 38.2. And that's how you get this minus 6.3. It's in minus because usually we do intervention minus control. And it's a bad outcome. So that's why it's a negative. And this upon this, so 31.9 divided by 38.2 is the risk ratio. So that's what they have expressed here, risk ratio and risk difference. And then I told you that the number needed to treat is basically 100 upon the risk difference. So 100 upon 6.3, and that's 16, right? So that's how you get all of these results from exactly the same data. So this is what the result of the trial is. And then all of these are different ways of expressing the same result. 16% is a relative risk reduction. So again, you have a relative risk of 0.84. That basically, if you do 1 minus 0.84, it's a 16% reduction in the outcome. 16% reduction. Relative risk reduction is 16%. And then the absolute difference I told you was minus 6.3, and then you have a number needed to treat, which is 100 upon 6.3. Okay. So any questions so far? Yeah, somebody's asked me, or Dr. Preeti's asked me, can absolute difference be mentioned as percentage? Yes, it can be. It is, in fact, absolute difference is the same as risk difference. So it can be expressed in percentage as well as decimal. And in fact, it's pretty much the same thing. So this can either be 6.3% or it can be 0.063. So it's referring to the same thing. Had it been expressed as decimal, then the number needed to treat would be 1 upon 0.063, which is again 60. Okay. So moving ahead, why should we care? Well, let me tell you about this webinar that I had attended. This was on, if you remember, DRDO came out with a powder, 2-deoxy-D-glucose, and it was purported to be a game changer in the world of treatments for COVID-19. And so Dr. Reddy, they held a webinar where they were announcing the results of their pilot trial. So this was the result of the trial. The representative from Dr. Reddy's expressed this in his presentation, and the outcome was more than or equal to 2-point improvement in the ordinal scale. So I think it was some WHO scale or new scale. And so symptom resolution was there, and improvement basically was the outcome. And they had two arms, of course, the intervention where they gave 2-deoxy-D-glucose, the powder, and then there was standard of care as control. And you can see here that 11% people improved with 2-deoxy-D-glucose and 6% improved with standard of care. And so this difference is 5%, right? But what he repeatedly emphasized was an 83% improvement with 2-deoxy-D-glucose, right? And I would do the same thing if I were making a pitch for a new drug on behalf of a pharma company. I would exactly do this. And in fact, when I had asked you that question in the first slide, most of you actually found the relative effect more appealing. You said, 25% improvement, that's what we would go for. When in fact, the difference was just 2%, right? So the point I'm trying to make is that when treatment effects are expressed in relative terms, they always look better. They always look more impressive. And let's consider these three populations. There's one trial which is studying a treatment, and the treatment basically reduces mortality by, say, 1/3. So that's a relative risk of 0.67. And then we apply that treatment result to three populations, right? So the first population is a population where the control arm has a 30% mortality. So the baseline risk is 30%. Now, if we apply the result of this trial, a relative risk of 0.67, that's a 1/3 reduction in mortality, then this 30% risk of mortality would go down to 20%, right? So that's a risk difference of 10%. Now consider another population where the baseline risk is 10%. So once again, this treatment would, so therefore it would go from 10% to 6.7%. That's a risk difference of 3.3%. And then finally, there's a third population, which is a very low risk population. The baseline risk is just 1% or 3%. And again, this treatment reduces mortality by 1/3, so it goes from 3% to 2%. That's a risk difference of 1%. Now, if I told you, so the same treatment, right? So the same treatment is reducing mortality by 1/3 in these three subpopulations. In one population is going from 30 to 20, when the other is going from 10 to 6.7, and the third is going from 3 to 2%. So if I told you that this is a very toxic chemotherapeutic agent with very high morbidity and very poor quality of life and very, very toxic in terms of really, I mean, the quality of life is deteriorating, and although it's prolonging mortality, it's prolonging life, but it is reducing mortality by 1/3, of course, in all of these populations. But do you think that given the toxicity, the population 3 would be ready to take that treatment? Do you really think that they would be willing to? And most of you will probably tell me that no, they may not be willing to take that treatment, because even though this population is witnessing a 1/3 reduction in mortality, but in absolute terms, it is just going from 3 to 2. Whereas in this population 1, probably most patients would want to at least consider or seriously consider this treatment, even though there's high toxicity, because there the mortality, although again it's reducing by 1/3, but it's going from 30 to 20, right? So the absolute reduction is way higher. So this is what usually happens, that relative effects tend to remain constant across subgroups, across subgroups of patients, whereas absolute effects differ because different populations are at different levels of baseline risk. Again, if you consider this new treatment, there's a new statin that reduces cardiovascular disease by 50%. That's a relative risk of 0.5. Now, if you apply this result to two very different populations, one is a high-risk individual, a 65-year-old smoker, hypertensive, elevated cholesterol. You could say the baseline risk of cardiovascular disease for this individual is 40%. And so this treatment would reduce it from 40 to 20. But if you apply it to a low-risk individual, just a 45-year-old with hypercholesterolemia, it will reduce it from 2 to 1. So relative effects tend to remain constant across subgroups, whereas absolute effects differ across subgroups. Now, given that you know now that what I told you about those three populations, what do you think is most important to patients, relative or absolute? So you can just type in your answer into the chat box. Which do you think is more important to patients, relative or absolute effect? And while you think about that, think about these three populations that I had told you about. Yeah, so people are getting it right. So absolutely, so absolute effects is what matters to patients, right? Because that is what, and somebody said both. Yes, of course, both, because relative is telling you about the magnitude of the effect, but then so is absolute. Because if you consider this population here, population 3, in terms of what they are gaining and suffering in terms of adverse events as well as gain in the primary outcome, there's a trade-off, as is the case with most treatments. And this population may not be willing to make that trade-off, because the absolute effect is not big enough, even though the relative effect is big. Right? So what matters to patients is actually absolute effects. And what studies highlight is mostly relative effects because they remain constant across subgroups. But this is what consort means when they say different audiences may prefer either relative or absolute risk. But both doctors and lay people tend to overestimate the effect when it is presented in terms of relative risk. The size of the risk difference is less generalizable to other populations than the relative risk, since it depends on the baseline risk of the unexposed group, which tends to vary across populations. So I think it's clear now what this means. The reason we use relative effects very often is because they tend to remain constant, usually. But we must apply that relative risk to our patient population because different populations are at different levels of baseline risk, which in turn affects the absolute gain in treatment effects that they are experiencing. And certainly, as you can tell from your own answers in that first slide, relative effects tend to look bloated. So they tend to look way more impressive than absolute effects, because treatment effects look bigger when expressed in terms of relative effects. Now, just a word about that number needed to treat. So consider this mammography program. This is an intervention for breast cancer screening. So they said mammography programs for 7 years reduce the incidence of death from breast cancer from 0.08 to 0.02%. So the risk difference here is 0.06%. And the number needed to treat is again, 100 upon 0.06, which is 1,666. What this means is that 1,666 ladies will need to have regular mammography for 7 years to prevent one death from breast cancer. And so this number needed to treat, what tells you is actually what is the amount of resources that have to go into an intervention, in terms of cost, in terms of effort, in terms of resources, any kind of resources. So what has to go into an intervention in order to get one beneficial outcome? And that idea is basically gained from number needed to treat. This is particularly very important for policymakers and health administrators, because you have to set up an ICU in your hospital, and you know that the cost of treating one patient in the ICU is $5,000, and you know that at least 5 people will have to be treated in order to prevent one death. So that is telling you basically that $25,000 will have to be spent in order to prevent one death. So it's giving you some idea of the cost effectiveness of intervention. And that's the advantage of number needed to treat, that it tells you what is the amount of resources that have to go into an intervention to get one beneficial outcome, and it gives you an idea of cost effectiveness. So any questions so far? I'll wait just a couple of seconds so that you can ask any questions if you have any. Okay. Okay, moving on. Now, if you're wondering, all of this discussion about relative risk and related concepts, what about odds? Well, odds are a very kind of like non-intuitive concept. Odds usually, it's a British concept that came up during horse racing. And you may have heard that, when they used to bet on horses in horse racing, they would not say that the probability of this horse winning is 50%. They would say the odds are 1:1, right? So what this is referring to is basically how the fraction is made. If you talk about risk is a simple concept. Risk is same as probability. So if I tell you the probability of it raining today is 60%, you will understand immediately what I mean. Probability is same as risk. So it is something happening upon, so if you consider it like a pie or a cake, it is the slice of the cake upon the entire cake. So a probability of 60% is 60 upon 100. That's the numerator part of the denominator. That is risk. Now, if you talk about odds is a concept where the numerator is not part of the denominator, which means it is the chance of something happening upon it not happening. So I won't say that if I express 60% probability of gaining in odds, then it is 6:10 or 3:5, right? So 3:5 is the odd, something happening upon it not happening. That is odds. And as you can see, it's not a very intuitive concept, so it's difficult to get your head around odds. But gamblers understand odds very well. So in the world of gambling or betting, they are usually familiar with odds. Odds of India winning the cricket match is 4:1. What is the probability of risk? It is 4 upon 5. That's 80%. So the probability or risk of India winning is 80%. But if you express it in terms of odds, it is 4:1. So let's consider, say, a study. let's say it's a trial only, and the outcome is mortality. And so this is the result of that trial. There were 100 persons in treatment arm and 100 persons in control arm. And so let's first talk about risk, in terms of risk. So in terms of risk, the risk of person dying in treatment arm is 20 upon the whole, 20 upon 100. Right? So 20% is the risk for the probability of dying in the treatment arm. The risk of dying in the control arm is 40 upon the total, 40 upon 100, that's 40%. And so relative risk is basically a ratio of these two risks. So 20 upon 40, that's 0.5. So risk ratio and relative risk is the same thing. It's referring to the same thing, which is basically a ratio of these two risks, right? It's a risk ratio. And risk in itself is the same as probability. Now, if I talk about odds, then the odds of dying in the treatment arm is 20 upon 80. So it is the chance of something happening upon it not happening. So 20 upon 80, that's 25% is the odds of dying in the treatment arm. And 40 upon 60 is the odds of dying in the control arm. That's 67% odds, 40 upon 60. And then a ratio of these two odds is the odds ratio. So 25 upon 67, it is 0.37. And this is the odds ratio. Now, this you can easily interpret. 0.5 is easy to interpret. It's just simply, it's a ratio of these two probabilities. This is a little difficult to interpret because it's a ratio of these two odds, and odds in themselves are basically, a difficult concept. So the reason that we usually deal with odds is because they have great statistical properties. So statisticians actually find it very easy to work with odds because they have great statistical properties. They're very symmetrical, easy to adjust, etc., etc. But as you can see, an odds ratio is always farther from 1 as compared to a risk ratio. So risk ratio is 0.5 and odds ratio is 0.37. It's farther from 1. The measure of its effect for both of these measures, which would mean no effect, is 1. So 1 relative risk and odds ratio means no association or no effect. So if you see relative risk of 1 or an odds ratio of 1, it basically means there is no effect or there is no association. Anything less than 1 in terms of treatment effect is protective, and more than 1 is a positive association. So here we're talking about treatment, prevention of dying, and you can see here that there's the odds ratio is always larger. So there's a larger reduction in odds as compared to risk. And so although odds ratio is difficult to interpret, but we need not worry about it so much, because if you look at this table, this basically is enlisting probability and the corresponding odds. Right, so here you have 80% probability, and here you have the corresponding odds, that's 4:1. Similarly, the 75% probability, so odds is 75:25, 3:1. So the odds is 3. You keep going further down. So here you have 50% probability, so that's an odds of 1:1, that's 1. So by the time you reach 10%, you will see that the odds and the probability, they start to approximate each other. So they're almost the same, 0.11 and 0.1. And then certainly if you keep going further and further down, they become exactly the same, So here they're exactly the same. Which means that when outcomes happen less than 10% of the time, then odds ratio and relative risk approximate each other. So they start to become the same, odds ratio and relative risk. And luckily, when we're talking about most outcomes, they do happen, less commonly. So we're talking about preventing mortality, we're trying preventing cardiovascular diseases or strokes or any such bad outcomes. They usually happen less than 10% of the time. And so in most situations, if you see an odds ratio, you're not going to be misled. It's going to approximate the risk ratio. However, if there's a situation where there's a very high probability of an outcome, so if it's a high risk population, so can you maybe tell me in the chat box, can you mention any such population you can think of where mortality happens higher than it happens quite commonly. Mortality happens quite commonly in these populations. Can you think of any such populations and tell me patient populations? Any diseases or any specific patient populations where mortality happens 30, 40% of the time, 50% of the time or higher? Immunocompromised, yeah. Any others? So, yeah, okay. I mean, specifically, where would you find these patients where they have very high mortality? In the hospital, where would you find them? Liver failure, absolutely. Certainly here in ILPS, we have a lot of patients in the liver ICU that have ICU, exactly, I was about to say that. So ICU, so critical care. Any other patients that you find very high mortality in? Any kind of disease you can think of where there's very high mortality? A disease that's infamous for having high mortality, no treatment, people are going to die. Yeah, exactly, malignancy, absolutely. So you got both of them. So those are two patient populations where if you see an odds ratio, there's chance that you might be misled. So you got both of those, right? One is cancer patients. So say you have a patient population of cholangiocarcinoma, there's such high mortality, 50% mortality. Or if you have critically ill patients, right? So again, I told you, critically ill patients certainly here in the liver ICU, 40, 50% mortality. So in these populations, if you see an odds ratio, you might get misled because it will make the treatment effect look bigger than it actually is. But other than these high-risk populations, most of the time, in most trials and in most studies, if you see an odds ratio, you're not going to be misled, don't worry, because when the outcomes happen less commonly, certainly less than 10% of the time, then the odds ratio and the relative risk approximate each other. Okay? So this is the bottom line. Relative risk is generally far larger than the risk difference. And therefore, we must consider relative risk reduction in light of the patient's baseline risk. Odds ratio are non-intuitive. So in most situations, when the baseline risk is low, odds ratio is not going to mislead. But it may be misleading, and those two populations that you correctly identified are critically ill patients and cancer patients, right? So with that, I'm going to go on to this is the first part of the session where we were talking about measures of association. And now we're going to talk about observational studies, however much the time permits. But before that, we can have our poll and we can have any other pressing questions that you have right now. We will also give you time in the end to ask questions. But right now, if you have any questions, please unmute your microphone and ask, or you type them into the chat box. I'll give you 1 minute to do that, and then we will start our poll. There's just a couple of true or false assertions, and we have one exercise. So any questions? If not, Mr. Ravi, could you please start the poll? So there's three true or false assertions, and I'll give you about 5 minutes to answer these. Okay, Dr. Preeti, what do you think? Should we end the poll or should we wait?
I think we can end the poll.
Okay. So here are the answers. So before I discuss this, there are a few questions in the chat box that let me just quickly address. Somebody's asked, can we assess relative risk using SPSS? Yes, we can. In fact, relative risk is basically just incidence and exposed upon incidence and non-exposed. So that we can do. It is there, you can calculate it. Logistic regression output should consider odds ratio. Well, logistic regression actually yields odds ratio only because, as I had told you, odds ratio has great statistical properties. So what logistic regression does is basically it is a method of adjustment. And in order to be amenable for adjustment, odds ratio has great properties. So logistic regression usually gives adjusted odds ratio. And there's actually a particular kind of design where we don't have a choice. We are stuck with odds ratio, and that's the case control design. So case control design, which I will talk about in just a minute, it is a design where we can't do anything. We are stuck with odds ratio, and logistic regression is a method of arriving at adjusted odds ratio. And what you asked here, XD is odds ratio, exactly. So you got it right. It is odds ratio, not relative risk. It is odds ratio. And or relative risk, you can calculate. In fact, if you're doing a trial or a study, and you can calculate both relative risk and odds ratio, and usually both are calculated also. So even in trials, they give a relative risk, but then very often now they adjust also. So they give an adjusted odds ratio also along with it, right? Now, the polls, the first assertion is odds ratio is a ratio of proportions. And most people actually said true. Now, to explain this, let me just go back to my slide where I told you about this one, yeah. So here, this is odds and this is risk, right? So in risk, we said that it is same as probability, same as a proportion, in the sense that the numerator is a part of the denominator, right? So this is actually a proportion. It is a proportion where the numerator is part of the denominator, and odds is a ratio. So the numerator is not part of the denominator. Now, when we talk about odds ratio or relative risk, you can see here that when we talk about relative risk, we talk about risk in exposed, which is 20%, risk in non-exposed, that's 40%. And then we take a ratio of these two risks, right? So risk ratio is the relative risk, which is itself a ratio, but it is a ratio of proportion. So the numerator and denominator are both in themselves proportions. And then we take a ratio of these two proportions, right? So relative risk is a ratio of proportion. Now, odds ratio, it is a ratio of odds, right? But what are odds? Odds is, again, I told you, something happening upon it not happening. So odds in themselves is actually a ratio, right? We're taking a ratio of mortality in treatment arm, ratio of mortality in control arm, and then we take a ratio of these two ratios, right? So odds ratio is a ratio of ratios, and relative risk is a ratio of proportion. Okay, so this statement, odds ratio is a ratio of proportion, that is false. This is false. Okay, odds ratio is a ratio of ratios. Okay, so hopefully that clarifies. The next statement, odds ratio approximates relative risk when the disease is common. And most people got this right. This is false. Because as I had shown you in that table, when the probability of an outcome is less, so when it happens less commonly, it happens certainly less than 10% of the time, then odds ratio and relative risk approximate each other, right? So this statement is false. Treatment effects tend to look bigger when expressed in relative terms as compared to absolute terms. And this most people got right, that this is true. And I had explained to you, and certainly you remember that webinar image that I had shown you, where they have said 83% relative improvement when the absolute improvement was just 5%, right? Okay, so the reason I had just 3 here is because we have actually another topic lined up. But I'm not sure if there's time. Let me just ask the organizers. Should I go ahead with quickly discussing at least one study, or should we, because we've covered 52 minutes already. So can you just let me know if I should go ahead with the next session?
Ma'am, I think we can continue. Like, do we have questions in the next session, ma'am, or PowerPoint and this thing?
No, we have slides.
Okay, ma'am. Fine.
Okay, let me do one thing. Let me just quickly discuss case control and cohort.
Okay, ma'am.
Or maybe just discuss one of those designs in detail, and then whatever pending topics are there, I can take up in the last session that we have, right?
Okay, ma'am. Fine.
Okay. All right. So, okay, we're talking about observational studies, and let me take you back to this diagram classification where I told you experimental, observational. Those are the two main classifications. And then within observational, we have cross-sectional studies, case control, and cohort studies. Now, case control and cohort studies have a directionality. So you're going from exposure to outcome, or from outcome to exposure. So there's sort of this longitudinal concept here. Whereas cross-sectional studies are just a snapshot study. So at one point, what is the situation? That is what is being studied in the cross-sectional study. So exposure and outcome, you're measuring at the same time, okay? There are a number of advantages. Strength of observational studies is that interventional studies are not always possible, right? So it's not always possible to assign an intervention. For instance, when we're studying harm, so mobile phone radiation and brain tumor, if this is your hypothesis that mobile phone radiation leads to brain tumor, then you can't do an RCT, right? So you have to do observational studies. They're rapid and efficient because, of course, less resources and fewer samples usually required, certainly in the case of case control studies. You can use existing data very often. So observational studies, sometimes are record-based also, like retrospective cohort studies. Take less time, expenses are lower. And for rare events, particularly case control studies are useful because we're actually going out there and we're recruiting cases. And for rare events, case control studies are very useful. Limitations are that they're subject to bias and confounding. There's limited power to study rare exposures and rare outcomes. So if you remember, we had a discussion on types of study designs where you had told me the solution to a problem. I had asked you that there's a hypothesis that that students good in anatomy in first year go on to become surgeons. And you had told me all of these different solutions, and we had discussed all of the study designs. And we had discussed previously that if you want to decide whether a particular study is a case control study or a cohort study, then you just have to ask yourself one question. And that question is your entry criteria of study subject based on presence or absence of outcome, right? So is your starting point, does this person have the outcome or not? If that is what you're starting with, then what you're doing is a case control study. For instance, if your hypothesis is that, again, mobile phone radiation leads to brain tumor, and what you do in your study is that you go out and you recruit patients of brain cancer, and then you correspondingly take control with people without brain cancer. And then if you ask them about their mobile phone use history, then that's a case control study because you're starting with those with the disease and those without the disease. Or in other words, the disease of questioning. So the presence or absence of outcome is where you're starting, as opposed to a cohort study. So in a cohort study, you start with exposure. So you will start out with measuring people's mobile phone use. You follow them up for 10, 20 years. You will have to follow them up because, it's like the outcome takes time usually. And so you will follow them up and then you will see who has the outcome and who does not. And that's a cohort study. And that can be done in two ways. It can be a retrospective or a prospective cohort. In retrospective cohort, again, you are going from exposure to outcome, but the exposure is already occurred back in time. So they are record-based studies, where you have a record of exposure. And prospective cohort studies, of course, you go from present to future. Retrospective, you go from past to present. So if you're not starting out with the outcome, whether you plan to follow up the same subject over a period of time to record events that have not yet occurred at the start of the study, then that's a cohort study. So a case control design is where you start here. You start with cases and controls, and then you ask them about their history. So whether they have the risk factor, they don't have the risk factor. Now, coming on to issues with regard to case control studies. The first is sample selection, and this is actually very, very challenging. In fact, the biggest challenge in epidemiology is recruiting controls. So recruiting appropriate controls is very difficult. It's one of the biggest challenges in epidemiology, and I'll tell you why. But sample selection is basically you need for cases a specific definition of disease. Who is diseased, right? And this case population can either be from the hospital or the population. They can be newly diagnosed, or you can restrict to cases with complete information on disease and exposure available. So there are a number of ways of recruiting cases, but who are controlled? They are people who would have been cases if they had developed the disease. So they are basically the population without the disease of question, so without the outcome of concern. They are the people who are serving as controls. And they could be patients in the same hospital with different disease, or from population or friends or neighbors or relatives. And they should have the same exclusion and inclusion as the cases, but with the only exception that they should not have the disease. And this is extremely challenging because you never know. Because, for instance, let me give you an extreme example. Say you are doing a case control study on the association of diabetes with cardiovascular disease. So if I'm doing a case control study of diabetes and cardiovascular disease, then who are my cases? Can you just type into the chat box, who are my cases? In a case control study on cardiovascular disease and diabetes, who are my cases? Where am I starting out with? Somebody said diabetic. So think again. Remember when in the previous slide I said that what you're starting with in a case control study are those with the outcome and those without the outcome. So the term cases refers to those that have had the outcome of interest, right? So yeah, right. So the cases are people with cardiovascular disease. Now say I take as control people who have stroke, right? So stroke patients become my control. Now why is that a problem? And you will tell me very intuitively that because stroke itself also is associated with diabetes, and so they have the controls there have a higher than expected proportion of the exposure. And that's the basic challenge of recruitment, because the controls may have a higher or lower than expected prevalence of the exposure, and that affects the conclusion of the case control study. Now, if I take as controls extremely healthy individuals like athletes, etc., who have no disease, very healthy, extremely healthy, then that would possibly lead to a spurious association, positive association. And it is for this reason that case control designs are inherently a very weak design, because there's challenges in recruitment of controls and challenges in recruitment of cases, right? Therefore, one epidemiologist said that there's only about 2-3 people in the world who can do a bias-free case control study. There's many challenges with conducting case control studies. Now, with regard to how do you measure the exposure status, it can be through interview and questionnaires, medical records. It would be very good if you have an objective measurement. And the interviewers, abstractors of records, cases, and control should be blind to the hypothesis. Now, why is this important? Say, again, let's just go to the example of mobile phone radiation and brain tumor. So if I'm doing a case control study, then what I'm recruiting is brain cancer patients, and my controls are healthy people. So people who do not have brain cancer. And then in a case control study, I have to ask them about exposure. So I start asking them, how much mobile phone did you use on average, number of hours per day, and then I find cumulative time, exposure, etc. Now, if I know that this is the hypothesis, and if I know that this patient is a brain cancer patient, if I'm not blinded to a case control status, and if I'm not blinded to the hypothesis, then I will ask in a way that is sort of like, reflective of that subjective feeling that probably this patient did talk on the phone more. So I may ask brain cancer patients more aggressively, more comprehensively, or are you sure you didn't spend more time, etc., 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 right? So the person who's measuring the exposure should be blinded to both case control status. Not always possible. Sometimes if it's face to face, then I can actually see, this patient is a patient of the concerned disease. Or sometimes even over the phone, if we're talking over the phone, even then it is possible to identify. But they should be blinded to the hypothesis, they should be blinded to case control status. So that's one methodological concern. Now, analysis, it is the same as that table that I had shown you earlier, where we have that 2x2 table. Now here, instead of the trial, treatment, and in control, we have exposed and non-exposed, right? But the calculation is exactly the same, right? So we find the odds of disease and exposed, and in this case, it is again A upon C, and then we find the odds of exposure and controls, right? So that's C upon D, and that is basically the same. So if you're asking cases how their exposure, you're finding out odds of exposure in cases, right? That's A upon C, and odds of exposure and control, that's B upon D. So, and then you take a ratio of these two odds, which is an odds ratio. So that's AD upon BC. That's why odds ratio is called a cross product ratio, right? The cross product ratio. Advantages, I told you, useful for studying rare conditions because we're actually going out and recruiting patients. It usually has a shorter duration and it's relatively inexpensive. It's usually the sample size is usually smaller than a cohort study, and it yields an odds ratio, which is usually a good approximation of relative risk, except in the case where the outcome happens very commonly. So I told you about those populations where it may be a concern. Disadvantages, I told you sampling. So there may be selection bias in recruitment of cases, selection bias in recruitment of controls. And I told you that recruitment of controls is very challenging. It does not establish sequence of events. So this temporality point of view, again, is not established in a case control study. It is established in a cohort study. There's potential bias in measuring predictors. So, for example, if we're doing a case control study on the exposure to radiation and congenital malformations, so antenatal exposure to radiation and congenital malformations. And so if we do a case control study, our cases will be mothers who gave birth to congenitally malformed children, babies, and our controls will be mothers that gave birth to normal children. And then we ask them about their radiation exposure history. Now, it is obvious that a woman who's given birth to a congenitally malformed child will think about this more. She will keep thinking about it. What did I do wrong? Why did this happen? Probably day in and day out, she's thinking about it. She's probably sitting up at night and thinking about it. So it's more likely, it's always the case that cases are more likely to remember their exposure as compared to controls. And this is called recall bias. recall bias. And this is an inherent limitation of case control studies, which we cannot do anything about. There's also potential survivor bias. So those cases that were so severe that they died will not be captured. We can only take those that were alive. And it's limited to one outcome variable. So we cannot study multiple outcomes. It's not that we can study the association of one risk factor with multiple outcomes. That we can do in a cohort study. So we can keep following them up and assessing multiple outcomes. In a case control study where we're starting out with exposure or starting out with outcomes, we can only go out there and recruit a particular kind of case. And it does not yield prevalence, incidence, or excess risk. So all of these, prevalence, of course, is yielded from a cross-sectional study. And incidence and excess risk is of course yielded from cohort studies. Incidence is number of new cases. So this in any case cannot be yielded from a case control study. Now, the issue of case control ratio is another one. How many controls to recruit for one case? And cases and controls in abundance and cost of eliciting information, when this is comparable, then we can take 1:1 ratio. But if cases are limited and there's differential cost of recruiting and eliciting information, then we can change the ratio. So for example, if cases are very few, then we can increase the number of controls per case. So for every one case we recruit, we take 2 controls or 3 controls. And why is this advantageous? That it increases power. What does that mean? That if there is an actual association, then our study will be able to pick up that association more if we take more number of controls to one case. But this is only true until a ratio of 1:4. So beyond 1:4, the power does not increase. Up to 1:4, it increases, and then beyond that, it plateaus. So yes, you can take a more number of controls per case, and you can take it up to 1:4. There's also the issue of whether to take prevalent cases or incident cases. Now, the advantage of taking prevalent case is that, of course, you have more cases, so it increases the sample size. But the disadvantage is that it may reflect determinants of duration of illness. So, prevalent cases don't give a very, they don't give as valid a result as incident cases, because the prevalent cases are already on treatment, so they're already modifying their lifestyle, etc. And so that adds to a lot of noise. So you don't have a very good sample of cases that you can actually associate with the exposure. But you have a lot of other things, like other determinants that went into treatment of the illness itself. And there's a lot of noise, right? So that is not a good thing. Whether a cause or it is related to prognosis, again, we don't know because they've been on treatment. Temporal sequencing more difficult, unavoidable circumstances, and incident cases can be taken within a specified time period. So sources of cases can be, again, 2 types, hospital-based or population-based. Hospital-based cases are those that are being treated. So they are cases that do not have the disease in question. So for example, if your cases are brain cancer patients, you can take cases from the surgery department or the gynecology department, or any other department that are free from the disease of concern. Or they can be from the general population. So community-based controls you can take by recruiting a random sample. Who can serve as control? It represents not the entire non-disease population, but a reference population of cases. So referred to as patients versus local patients, referred patients versus local patients. And we exclude controls that have diseases known to be associated positively or negatively with the exposure. So again, if you're doing a case control study of smoking and lung cancer, your cases are lung cancer patients, but don't recruit bronchitis patients as controls because they also have a higher than expected prevalence of smoking. So that is one big issue, that the control should not have a higher or lower than expected prevalence of the exposure. Also, exclude controls with conditions that might have resulted in change in exposure levels. So, for example, if you're doing a case control study of coffee drinking and pancreatic cancer, then we can't recruit peptic ulcer patients as controls because of their peptic ulcer, they will have reduced their coffee intake. So that would cause a bias. And also control should come from the population at risk of the disease. So, for example, it is inappropriate to have males as control for gynecological ailments or infants for Alzheimer's disease. So they should be at risk. And in fact, they should be similar to cases theoretically in every way, except for the fact that they don't have the disease that we are studying. Now, this was an actual case control study that was published in NEJM in 1980s, where McMahon and colleagues, they did a case control study, and they said coffee and cancer of the pancreas. This was the title. And the principal finding from this study was that coffee drinking leads to pancreatic cancer. Now, what was not clear is whether this was a real association or if there was a third factor that was responsible for a spurious association. And also one such factor is smoking. So smoking is associated with coffee drinking. Certainly back then in the 1980s, it was rare to find a smoker that does not drink coffee. And also smoking is an independent risk factor for cancer pancreas. So this association may actually not be a true association, but it may have been confounded. So this is a confounding factor. It may have been confounded by a third factor that's associated with both exposure and outcome. Okay, and there's a third criteria which I will tell you later. So that is where the question of matching takes place. Matching is a method that is undertaken in order to nullify the effect of confounding. And the question that we are trying to address is whether the observed association could be due to differences between cases and controls in factors other than the exposure. It may be a factor that's both associated with exposure and outcome. So the answer is to match the factors about which we are concerned. So for instance, here, when we recruit a pancreatic cancer case that smokes, we will also recruit a control that smokes. And certainly, usually age and sex, they are common confounding factors. And so in most case control studies, you will find that they have recruited age and sex matched controls. So age and sex matching almost always happens. This can be done either as group matching or individual matching. So individual matching is 1:1. So when you recruit a case, you also recruit a corresponding control that's matched. Or it could be frequency matching. So the proportion of males, the proportion of females in the entire group of cases, they are matched to the group of controls. Then you have a design called the nested case control study, which is basically that you have an ongoing cohort study and you have people who are developing the disease in that cohort. And then as soon as one case develops, you recruit a corresponding control from that ongoing cohort. So case one can control one, then subsequently another case develops and you recruit another control, and so on and so forth, right? So you keep apart from the ongoing cohort, and as case develops, you do a nested case control study within this ongoing cohort. So for example, if you have a hospital where you have dengue cases coming in, you have a cohort of dengue cases for one season, and then you want to know what are the risks for mortality, right? So mortality is happening within this cohort. Not everybody is dying, but some people are dying. And so you take a case that died and you take corresponding control from that same cohort, and then you compare their baseline characteristics, or you compare the severity scores, or you compare some baseline lab parameter, etc. Right? So you recruit cases in control. And I think I'll finish here because cohort study is going to take up some more time. And I will stop here for questions, and maybe we can take up the pending topics when we have time in the last session. So we can take up subgroup analysis and cohort studies at that time. And I will be grateful for any questions that you have right now before we wrap up the session. Any questions? So you can please type in your questions into the chat box. Or you can unmute your microphone and ask any questions related to measures of association or any of the previous sessions or case control studies. Previously also we had discussed some important topics. Okay, if not, then I think we can wrap up. Dr. Preeti, what do you think?
Ma'am, we still have some time, like it's 7:20. So if you want to complete the cohort studies, also I think.
No, I can complete what might be too much for too many concepts. But
Check.
I think there is one question. Group
That's the
matching for age and gender should be group matching for age and gender should be recruitment after. Okay. So I think I understand what you're saying. No, so basically, group matching happens. So basically, yeah, you're trying to, when you recruit a proportion of, when you recruit a group of cases, then the proportion of age groups and the proportion of males and females should match with the control group. So that is what is it, is that as opposed to 1:1 matching. So frequency matching we do if you take a particular person of a particular age group, it won't be exactly matched, but plus minus. So that's a value judgment. Plus minus maybe 1 or 2 years. You take a control that is of that age group, and you take a similar, the same sex. So a male of 80 years, you take a control plus minus 1 year, and who's male. Suppose total 80 cases. Yeah, so I mean, so if there's total number of 80 cases and 50% of them are men, then the control group will also have 50% men. That is group matching for gender. Any other questions? There's one exercise that I have. We can do that. Okay, somebody's asked how to undertake cluster RCT. So a randomized control trial, I had discussed the prototype, but there are different modifications of the randomized control trial. Now, a randomized control trial typically is where we randomize individuals. So particularly for drugs or for devices or for vaccines, etc., we randomize individual people. But for public health interventions and health policy interventions, it makes sense more to randomize groups of people. So a cluster randomized control trial is a type of RCT where we randomize groups of people or populations rather than an individual person. And these groups of people can be villages, or they can be hospital wards, or they can be districts, right? So for example, if there is, say, a health intervention in terms of hand washing, right? So hand washing intervention that we are doing, we're doing health education with regard to hand washing. And here we randomize villages. So in one village, we aggressively impart the intervention, in the other we don't. And then we follow them up and see and we compare, how do those clusters do? Rather than individual comparisons, we compare clusters. And then there are modifications of cluster RCTs also. So there's something called the stepped wedge design, which is basically that sequentially all of the clusters come into the intervention, but sequentially. And so you can make comparisons in between. So basically a cluster RCT is an RCT where we don't randomize individuals, we randomize groups of people rather than individuals. And these groups of people can be in terms of villages, they can be in terms of hospital wards, etc., etc. Okay, we have more questions coming in, and I'm happy about that. Age variation in control group compared to case acceptable. This is a value judgment. So you have to think for yourself, in terms of impacting the exposure level, what plus minus age group do you think will be reasonable? And it also depends on availability. So a number of considerations go into it. It's a value judgment which you have to take. So plus minus one, plus minus two, what do you think would? But too much should not be there. So if you take plus minus five, then possibly age itself will be a determinant, right? So that you should not do. But it's a value judgment with regard to how much doesn't matter. Can we do randomized subjects in RCT? When do we do cluster RCT? Yes, we randomize subjects in an RCT because that is basically the design, a randomized control trial. I'm sorry if I did not get your question. Please clarify. And when do we do cluster RCT? We do it when it makes more sense. It's a population level intervention. So say you're doing a health policy intervention in the hospital. So one person is not the person of interest. Your entire hospital. So you will randomize wards maybe to see what is the effect. Similarly, if it's a large population level intervention, like health policy intervention, say you're starting risk stratification using a new technology in the population level screening. So there, one person is not of interest. You're doing it for the entire population. So there, a cluster on randomized control. So usually for public health interventions, we do cluster randomized control trials are more important or certainly pertinent. What is the minimum number of samples required for case control studies? Age and gender matching is compulsory required. The minimum number of samples required, there is no such thing because it depends on the exposure level in control, and it depends on what is the probable strength of association between risk factors. It depends on those two things. So what is the probable strength of association? If it is a small association, you will need more samples. With a very big, strong association, you will need fewer. And it depends on the other thing it depends on is the exposure level in control. So those two things determine the sample size. And is age and gender matching compulsorily required? No, it is good, but then there are other ways also to control for confounding. So confounding can be controlled either in the design stage or in the analysis stage. In the design stage, matching is one method to control confounding. There are other methods also. But if you don't do it in design stage, then during analysis stage, we can do adjustment. So somebody had mentioned logistic regression. That is a method of adjustment. Similarly, there are other methods like Mantle-Hansel equation, etc. They're all methods to nullify that prognostic imbalance that is there amongst the cases and controls in terms of that third factor. So that is what adjustment is doing. It's creating comparable groups. And then you take a weighted average and you have an adjusted estimate. So that can be done during analysis also. But it is good, and it is usually done that age and sex matching is at least done in a case control study. Suppose case mean age is 24, then what would be control expectable? I think maybe plus minus 1 or plus minus 2 years. Can we take random samples for a state and project results? Is it must to use random number table for randomization? I do according to my personal level. Is it valid? If not, why? Okay, so let me first address this random number table. Yes, the way to correctly do randomization is to use a random number table. And nowadays, most people use a computer-generated random number table. So you have a number of websites online where number table. And I don't know what you mean by personal level, but certainly not in terms of alternation. So alternate date of birth, alternate day, alternate patient ID, etc. should not be used for randomization. Chit method is also not good. What you do is that you create a random number sequence and you hide it from the recruiter. That is called allocation concealment. And you can generate the random number table on the computer. Can we take a random sample for a state of project results? I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that, but I mean, if you're talking about a prevalence study, then certainly a random sample is required because that would increase representativeness. If you're doing a prevalence study or a cross-sectional study. But if I missed the question, then you please let me know. If one group, there is large number lost in RCT, how to adjust? Well, you can't adjust as such because complete follow-up affects, if there's incomplete follow-up, then it affects the validity of the trial. But what you can do is, you can do a sensitivity analysis. So for the population that is lost to follow-up, you make some certain assumptions and you start imputing. So for example, if there is a proportion of population that is lost in one arm in the RCT, then you impute or you assume that they have maybe 5 times the event rate compared to control group. Then how does that affect the result? So you're basically testing the robustness of your results by making assumptions about the population lost to follow-up. That is called sensitivity analysis. So your conclusion, whether it is valid or not, and to what extent it is fragile in terms of changing the conclusion, that you can test using sensitivity analysis. So lost to follow-up, again, you can't do anything about it because your study is over and that population is lost to follow-up. It is inevitable also. People will drop out, people will be lost to follow-up. But you can test the robustness of your conclusion in the trial by doing a sensitivity analysis, which is basically you make assumptions about the population lost to follow-up and you see whether that affects the conclusion of your trial. How to make adjustments? Well, no, you can do, so consider them alive. No, that is the best case scenario. If you do a best case scenario, that does not test the robustness of the result. You basically have to do a worst case or plausible worst case. So in a worst case scenario, you will assume that all of them died, right? And in a plausible worst case scenario, you will not assume that all of them died, but rather you will say that they have 5 times the control event rate or 4 times the control event rate as compared to the control. So basically you make some sort of a plausible worst case scenario. So they're both forms of imputation. How to mention limitation of an RCT study? Well, there are a number of limitations and all of those methodological concerns that we spoke about in the previous session, that whether blinding could be adequately taken care, whether complete follow-up could be done or not, whether allocation concealment was there or not, whether we had a good random sequence or not. All of these methodological concerns are what forms the strengths and limitations of the RCT. So all of the methodological concerns that we had spoken about, you please go through all of them, and they are the ones that form the strengths and limitations. And intention to treat analysis, when is it applicable? In a superiority trial, the credible analysis is always intention to treat. Why? Because, as we had discussed previously, intention to treat analysis is basically that you're taking all of the patients who are randomized to a particular arm into the analysis in their respective arms, irrespective of whether they got the treatment or not. So in other words, once randomized, always analyzed. Now, the reason this is important, if you remember the story I had told you about the statin, the new treatment in the NEJM trial, the reason it is important is because we created 2 groups through randomization, which are prognostically balanced. So those 2 groups of people that we've created through randomization, they have the same destiny, right? So they have the same prognosis, absolutely prognostically balanced. Now, if we take only compliers, so only those who took the treatment into our analysis, what we're taking out of the analysis is a group of people that are not the same as those that are included. So we have disturbed that prognostic balance that randomization created in the first place. So we went through all the trouble to randomize, and then we threw it away. We threw away that advantage because we did not keep that sanctity. So we did not keep that prognostic balance in our analysis. And that is the main reason that intention to treat should be done, right? That you have to maintain the prognostic balance that randomization created. The other reason to do intention to treat is that it is a more conservative estimate. So it is more difficult to show an effect with intention to treat as compared to a core protocol. And then the third is that in case of a crossover, so in case say you have a medical and a surgical arm, and five people from medical required surgery because they were so severe, then intention to treat actually tells you the real world situation. What is the real world situation? So it is more representative of real world. But the main reason to do intention to treat is to retain the prognostic balance that randomization created. And this is the most credible for a superiority trial. There's a particular kind of trial called non-inferiority trial, where this is not, intention to treat may not be the most credible analysis, right? So in non-inferiority trial is an exception. It is a trial where we must do both. We must do both intention to treat as well as per protocol. And if they both suggest the same thing, then we are good. Then we are reassured that the result is fine. But in a non-inferiority trial, intention to treat may actually be anti-conservative. So it may actually not be the conservative analysis. And yeah, Dr. Preeti rightly said that we had discussed all of these issues in the previous session, and you can actually access it on YouTube or from the NAMS website. I don't know where. I'll just given a link. Okay. Minimum sample of clinical trial. Again, if there's no such thing, some people say 30, but that's not a rule in any study. It depends on, again, what is the control event rate and what is the effect size. So it depends on these two things. How to minimize personal bias in RCT? Personal bias, I think you mean that the investigator determines who should get the treatment. Well, all of those, again, methodological issues that we addressed, blinding, allocation, concealment, those two methods help to prevent selection bias, help to prevent information bias in terms of investigator bias. So those are all basically safeguards in place to prevent these biases only. So random sequence generation, allocation concealment, blinding, complete, etc., etc. You know, they're all there to prevent these kinds of biases. What are the common mistakes done by people, by PIs in an RCT? Random sequence generation I've seen being done incorrectly a lot because people use alternation, they use deterministic methods of random, non-random allocation. And the other method that the other mistake that Consort says is done is that they put a p-value in the baseline characteristics table. That is very commonly done, which may not be necessarily wrong, but it's not meaningful. It's not at all meaningful because what that p-value is telling you is basically whether the difference in the two groups is by chance, but any difference that occurs has to be by chance. So that's not very meaningful. The other mistake is in the analysis. So again, intention to treat should be followed. And basically reporting guidelines should be followed. So go through the consort reporting guidelines for RCTs because a number of things in the reporting guidelines there's a huge lacunae in terms of whether they're being followed or not. So the consort guidelines should be followed and should be certainly considered very carefully before reporting the results of the RCTs. And then in terms of a specific type of RCT in the non-inferiority trial, there are special considerations. So it's a kind of trial design where mistaken claims of non-inferiority are very, very common. So non-inferiority trials are gaining popularity in medicine in almost every field. And the amount of misinterpretation that's happening in these trials is very, very rampant. And so that is a special consideration. That's a very common mistake in that. I'm so happy that you're sending in your questions for this session. In a cross-sectional study, what will be our strategy of analysis of data? It depends on what your objective is. Analysis always follows from the objective. So there's a universal method or plan for analysis as such. if your purpose in the cross-sectional study was just to find prevalence, only to find prevalence, then what you will do in the analysis is basically a simple prevalence. So how many people had the outcome, but along with that, you please give a 95% confidence interval also. So that is one mistake that people make, even in simple prevalence cross-sectional studies, that they don't give a 95% CI, but you must give that. Excuse me, in order to reflect the uncertainty in your data and the range of plausible values consistent with your data. So you must give your 95% CI. And if you're doing an analytical cross-sectional study, so if you're trying to find an association between two factors, say exposure outcome, then what you will do is a logistic regression. So you do a logistic regression, you find adjusted odds ratios, and you report it in terms of measures of association like odds ratio. So that will be logistic regression. Then there's a question about COVID-19 epidemic, current status in future. I don't know if that's relevant here, but maybe we can again discuss that later on. Observational study cannot be done at this point. What is the solution of the thesis? Cannot be done. Okay, so at least in the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of centers allowed systematic reviews to be done as thesis. I don't know if it is allowed in your center, but certainly a lot of centers this was allowed. Systematic reviews and meta-analysis served as one thesis. The other thing you can do is maybe do a small pilot study. Just do a small study on a new topic, which may add to literature and guide further investigation in that direction, if you can't do a very big study at this point. Should we do insurance for all intervention studies? No, not insurance, but you have to do certain things before you embark on doing your trial, like registration. So you must register your trial in any registry, CTRI or CTRI or any other registry, and you must have a protocol ready that you must register properly, and you must do all of those formalities before you can do your trial. Prevalence may change in acute diseases in observational study. Well, usually prevalence term is used for chronic diseases. Usually, so prevalence is the total number of cases that are there at any given point, and it makes more sense to report prevalence for a chronic disease. Acute diseases like diarrhea, you don't usually report prevalence, because they come and go. So in that case, incidence is more meaningful. And that's why, prevalence is usually reported for chronic diseases, because the total number of cases. Which is best institution to undertake training in epidemiology? Well, I don't know. In India, there's All India Institute of Medical Sciences, and there's public health institutes all over the country of eminence. I think maybe probably the seniors on this forum are more suited to answer that question. Difference between point prevalence and period prevalence. So point prevalence is at one particular point in time. Period prevalence is a similar concept, but you say from this period to this period, and then you take a prevalence. So the concept is similar, just that you're specifying the duration in your point prevalence. The denominator is still total number of people, just that in period prevalence you have a time duration where you're measuring the numerator rather than just at one point. Okay, and that actually answers all the questions that are there. Okay, I think we spent a sufficient amount of time in the Q&A also today, luckily. And I think Sood sir is here for making concluding remarks also.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It has been a very interactive session. I would now like to invite Professor Ajay Kumar Sood sir to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you once again, Dr. Manya, for a very nice presentation. And the fact that so many questions have come, that means that our participants have understood some of the basic concepts. So my suggestion to participants is that once you have these basic concepts given during this series of 6 lectures, it is always better that you discuss among yourself with your friends, and also refer to some of the standard books on epidemiology, which I am sure Dr. Manya will tell you in the end what are the reference. My suggestion is some of the classical studies. Dr. Manya, if you can give them the reference, they can actually go through those classical study and actually know how to calculate various types of rates and ratios that will help them, because many of them are our PG students. So thank you once again. And once again, I will like to emphasize that these lecture series can give you broad concepts. It is not going to replace your regular training. So please keep that point in mind. And the best approach would be that whatever has been discussed over these 3 days, in these 3 lectures, maybe over the weekend on the Sunday, you can have discussion and refer to some of the standard books. And whatever your queries and questions are there, you can post us so that we can take care in the next week. And the next week again is going to be very, very important for especially for the postgraduate, because statistical concepts are going to be discussed. What is basic concepts in statistics, and many of our PG students are really, they want to know which type of statistical test they are going to use for their thesis analysis. So once again, I request to our participants, please encourage your colleagues to attend this session. These sessions are very, very important for you, especially when you're preparing for your thesis and writing papers. And once again, I want to emphasize that this Navigate CME program is not only limited to these sort of lecture series. We have further plans, and I'm happy to mention that we have received responses from more than 100 faculty members across the country from various medical colleges, and they have kindly agreed to be named faculty mentors. So maybe in future, we are going to sort of identify, classify them specialty-wise, expertise-wise, and maybe some of you participants, especially our junior resident, they can be attached with the faculty mentor on email for guiding and for other technical support. Another aspect is related to the e-library concept. So this again, I think, is going to be very useful to you. And even you can contribute. So some of the residents who are senior resident or who are in the final year, you can also contribute some of the topics, and we will be happy to put them with your name on our website so that others can refer to that. So with these words, once again, I thank all of you. Special thanks to Dr. Manya, because I understand these sessions are very long. It is very difficult for 2 hours to keep the participant busy, but you have done a wonderful job. So thank you for that. Again, thanks to Dr. Preeti for moderating and helping us throughout this program. And of course, the technical support given by Mr. Ravi and Mr. Anil, who are there on a vacation, on a holiday, and helping us. So with these words, I again thank you all, and again look forward for your active participation next week for the rest of the 3 lecture series. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am. And I thank all the participants.
Thank you.
I declare this academic session closed.
Thank you.